Hi everyone! I hope you've had an excellent week so far. Thanks for tuning in to my presentation today. As mentioned in previous discussions, one of my areas of interest lie within the realm of race, ethnicity, and racism. Therefore, for my first presentation, I chose to present on race, ethnicity, and racism. To preface, in Sociology 100, you likely encountered some discussions surrounding the concepts of race, ethnicity, stereotyping, and racism, among other terms. If you completed Sociology 368, Race and Ethnic Relations, then you may also possess some advanced knowledge on the subject. However, for the purpose of my presentation, I wanted to situate it as if I were discussing the subject with folks who may not be as familiar with the subject as I am. So, for some of you, this may be a review of some foundational concepts within my area of interest. With that, let's get into it. To begin, I want to provide a brief overview of what will be covered in the presentation. Firstly, I have divided the presentation into two parts. Part 1 covers the concept of race and ethnicity, applying race and ethnicity to an example and the process of racialization. Then, we will move into an opportunity for reflection where I will provide some questions. Moving into Part 2, we will discuss stereotyping, discrimination, and racism with some examples to help you better understand the concepts. In addition, we will also discuss the importance and significance of the subject in the contemporary context. In this section, I will outline some examples as to why race and ethnicity and racism need to continue to be studied. Lastly, I will wrap up my presentation with some review questions. Part 1, entitled How We See Ourselves and Others, will focus on the foundational concepts of race and ethnicity. Now that I have mentioned the terms race and ethnicity several times, you are likely wondering precisely what they mean. So, we will go ahead and define both concepts. Race can be defined as a term of classification used to identify humans based on physical characteristics. So, for example, you may make assumptions about the race of an individual based on physical characteristics such as skin color, hair texture, eye color, and eye shape, among others. Moreover, it should be noted that sociologists view race as a social construction. When we identify a concept as being socially constructed, we refer to a concept that has been created and accepted by humans in a society. Think social as related to society and construction as related to creation. Now, looking at ethnicity, there's a greater level of complexity, which could be separated into two terms. The first term, ethnic origin, otherwise known as objective ethnicity, describes the ethnic characteristics of your ancestors. The second term, ethnic identity, otherwise known as subjective ethnicity, describes how you personally identify your ethnicity. So for both of these terms, they're related to characteristics such as language, culture, traditions, and holidays, for example, that are not physical. However, the second term, ethnic identity, differs from the first because it is self-defined. Therefore, there are differences in how others identify you versus how you identify yourself. In other words, when you examine race, you are looking at a group of a number of individuals all together. For example, Asians as a whole. Whereas when you examine ethnicity, you are looking at deviations of a number of individuals within that group. For example, within the race of Asians, there are East Asian groups such as Chinese, Japanese, or Korean people. As well, there are also Southeast Asian groups such as Filipino, Laotian, and Vietnamese people. Now that you know what both race and ethnicity mean, I want to help you apply these concepts by using an example from sociology in my personal life. Taking a look at this photo I have on my screen, you are viewing an image of 7 individuals of diverse genders with each letter of the acronym MOVSA 1920 distributed across each one of their faces. The presenter, me, is located on the far right-hand side. I'm wearing a pink dress. Focus in on me on the far right-hand side. When you're looking at this photo of me, I want you to first consider the term race. Based on physical characteristics, such as skin color or eye shape, among other characteristics, one could assume that I'm Asian, which is correct. This is a surface-level observation based on physical characteristics. It should also be noted that physical characteristics within a race are not always consistent, especially when we break it down in terms of ethnicity. Look at the photo of me again, but this time I want you to consider the term ethnicity. It's a bit more difficult, isn't it? Consider the two terms in regard to ethnicity that I had mentioned before, ethnic origin and ethnic identity. As I'm presenting in English, you could assume that my ethnic origin is Canadian, which is somewhat true as the previous generation, my dad, is a naturalized Canadian. However, in regard to ethnic identity, I identify as Vietnamese as well. Though there have been numerous times where I've been misidentified as being Chinese, or on other occasions where I have been misidentified as being half white. That would be an example of ethnic origin. The ability to define myself, my ethnic identity, versus the way in which others may choose to define me, my ethnic origin, is an important distinction, which can be demonstrated through this example. With ethnicity, you are looking beneath the surface, based on other characteristics that vary from ethnic group to ethnic group. To wrap up this section, I would like to introduce you to one last term, racialization. The term racialization can be defined as the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified relationship, social practice, or group. For example, I can be racialized as Asian. Racialization can be described as a dynamic process. In saying this, I am stating that racialization is not static. It is a process that can change and warp over time. Lastly, racialization also poses social, economic, and political consequences. Some of these consequences will be explored in Part 2. Reflecting on the previous slide on racialization, I want you to consider these questions before we move into Part 2. More specifically, have you had any experiences where your race or ethnicity came into play? If so, can you explain? If not, can you recall an experience where another individual's race or ethnicity came into play? For example, you can note an example from a film or within the news, etc. Either of these experiences can be positive or negative. I just kind of want you guys to get thinking about these concepts and then later on apply them to the additional information you will learn. As a reminder, Part 2 is entitled The Consequences of Seeing Others and focuses on stereotyping, discrimination, and racism. For this section, I want you to refer back to the terms race, ethnicity, and racialization. Race and ethnicity are terms that have been used to classify and define a person or groups of people. Sometimes these classifications and definitions can lead to oversimplified generalizations of a person or a group of people, which is defined as a stereotype, especially in the realm of race. In addition, it should also be noted that stereotypes are both positive and negative, even though there are times where we may hear more about negative stereotypes than positive ones. For example, check out the photo on the right. The photo is of a Time magazine cover depicting 6 Asian American adolescents, where the headline reads, "Those Asian American whiz kids." Based on the headline, one can infer that Time magazine classifies Asian American adolescents as gifted, intelligent, and smart. So in other words, they're a whiz. This would be an example of positive stereotyping. Although the presented stereotype is positive, it does not necessarily mean that the effects will be. For example, the term model minority identifies a successful minority population based on their levels of educational attainment, financial earnings, among other factors. Overall, they're measuring their success. In many cases, Asians have been described as the model minority. And the concept of the model minority is based in stereotypical assumptions and classification of Asians as hardworking and intelligent. However, this can pose detrimental and in some cases really dire effects, such as a lack of support for an Asian student because it is assumed that they are intelligent and smart. Therefore, they do not need additional support. In turn, some students actually may feel the pressure to live up to an image of being intelligent and smart, leading to a kind of internalized model minority. Moving forward, the way in which we see and think about people and the assumptions we have, especially based in race, can inform how we treat them. More notably, this can lead to forms of discrimination. The term discrimination, which can be defined as the unfair or unjust treatment of another person or groups of people, can be rooted in characteristics such as race, sex, gender, or age. Racial discrimination, otherwise known as racism, is a specific type of discrimination based on aspects of physical appearance such as skin color, among others. To provide an example, racism against the Chinese and Asian community at large during the COVID-19 pandemic is an example. To your right, you will see a screenshot of a headline from a CBC News article. In the article, it discusses the results of a poll aimed at Chinese Canadians conducted by the Angus Reid Institute, where it was discovered that the discomfort and discrimination faced by Chinese Canadians due to their ethnicity was happening during COVID-19. However, looking more into the poll, the results of the poll can be generalized to the larger Asian Canadian population due to concepts that we discussed previously, like race and racialization. Because race is rooted in perceived similar physical characteristics, such as hair color and eye shape, individuals with specific physical characteristics are being targeted. Therefore, you do not need to identify as ethnically Chinese to be targeted. This is especially evident in the last paragraph of this article because the article closes on the experience of an Indigenous woman who had been the target of an anti-Asian racist attack. So despite this woman's racial background, and due to the perpetrator's assumption and subsequent racialization of her as Asian, she was targeted. But that doesn't necessarily mean that she identifies as Chinese or Asian. To wrap up this section, I just want you to reflect back on the term racialization that I had mentioned earlier. I want to reiterate that specifically, racialization is a dynamic process, and it is clearly demonstrated here when I mention how Asians have been racialized as whiz kids, moving on to how, due to their racialization, Asians have become the target of blame during COVID-19. So we went from a kind of more positive image of Asians to now a more negative image of Asians, and that's due to their racialization, which is, again, a process that is dynamic. Therefore, the way in which we see and think about people and the assumptions we have about them and the way in which we treat them can change over time. And that's demonstrated again here with the example of Asians before the pandemic and during the pandemic. Moving forward, I just want you to think about 2020. So the year 2020 was fraught with a number of challenges and difficulties. Many of them actually were connected to race, ethnicity, racialization, and racism. So for example, the photo of a group of women at the top is taken from an article which discusses anti-Asian racism, which has arisen to COVID-19 like I had discussed previously. Continually, on the far right-hand side, there's a photo that depicts a Black Lives Matter movement rally, which was in response to the death of George Floyd, depicted in the sign, a Black man who was murdered by police due to his racialization as Black and subsequent mistreatment. Floyd's death renewed the conversation surrounding race and police brutality. Also, the woman in the hoodie is Joyce Eschwan, an Indigenous woman who died because she received insufficient medical care due to racism she experienced at a Quebec hospital. Eshwan's death actually amplified the conversation surrounding discrimination and racism within Canada's medical system. Lastly, a headline from a CBC News article reads, MacEwan University students accuse administrators of failing to take action on racism. This was actually taken from a recent news article written this month where students spoke out about racism at MacEwan. In closing, actually all of these examples illustrate the application of race, ethnicity, racialization, and racism within our everyday lives, both in the past and into the future. And not only that, it demonstrates the continued importance and significance that it has had on us, the communities we are a part of, the institutions we are connected to, and the society that we all live in. Wrapping up, I have outlined a few review questions to help you retain the knowledge you have learned today, such as, what is the difference between race versus ethnicity? Can you identify two different characteristics for each? What is the process of racialization? And how can race and ethnicity shape how we treat others? Can you identify an example of racism aside from the one provided? For a hint, you can check out the question below, which is, why should race, ethnicity, and racism be studied today? Thinking about the presentation as a whole now, I also want you to consider the two questions I posed before. Namely, have you had any experiences where your race or ethnicity came into play? If so, can you explain it? If not, can you recall an experience where another individual's racialization came into play, like in a movie or in the news, for example? You can identify your own experience or reflect upon the experiences discussed within this presentation, and feel free to put them in the discussion box. And lastly, if you have any questions for me, I welcome them at the email on my screen, and I want to thank you all for listening.